On a Tuesday morning in April, in a Christie's auction house on Park Avenue in Manhattan, a woman in a white Chanel blazer turned to the man beside her and laughed. Not the polite kind. The kind that fills a room because it doesn't care who hears it. He was wearing a canvas work jacket with a dried paint streak on the left shoulder. His name was Daniel Reeves. He was 39 years old. He was a single father from Akron, Ohio, who had driven 11 hours through the night to be sitting in that particular chair at that particular auction. And the woman laughing at him was Celeste Verano, CEO of Verano Holdings, a real estate and private equity firm headquartered in Midtown, whose net worth Forbes had estimated the previous year at somewhere north of $400 million. She had a 2023 Ferrari Roma Spider parked in the garage 2 blocks away. She had bid on every significant lot at this auction for the past 6 years. She had never lost one that she wanted. She looked at Daniel the way people look at something that wandered into the wrong room and said, loud enough for the row behind them to catch it, "I'll bet you the Ferrari you can't outbid me on a single lot today, any lot you choose." The room shifted. A few heads turned. A Christie's assistant pretended to study her catalog. Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the program in his hand. Then he looked at her and said, "I don't want the Ferrari." She stopped smiling. "Then what do you want?" He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "If I win," he said, "I want first right of refusal on the Whitmore estate parcels, all 4. The woman who hadn't lost a lot she wanted in 6 years looked at him with a completely new expression, not amusement, something that was trying to decide if it was respect or alarm. She said, "Done." Nobody in that room thought he had a chance. But 32 minutes later, Daniel Reeves had not won a single lot. He had bought the entire auction. And what happened in those 32 minutes had nothing to do with money. It had to do with a letter he had been carrying in his jacket pocket for 11 months, written by a man who had died before anyone understood what he had built. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this one travels. Stay until the end because the auction is only the beginning. Daniel left Akron at 7 in the evening the night before the auction, which meant he was on the road by 7:15, because it took him 15 minutes to make sure his daughter was settled and had everything she needed, and had confirmed twice with his neighbor, Mrs. Petrocelli, that she understood the morning routine. Emma was 9 years old, which was old enough for Mrs. Petrocelli to drop her at school, but not old enough for Daniel to feel easy about leaving her overnight without significant logistical preparation. He drove a 2018 Ford Ranger that had 112,000 miles on it and a passenger side speaker that only worked when the heat was on. He had the heat on the whole way. He listened to a podcast about the history of Chicago architecture for the first 2 hours, then switched to quiet because he needed to think, then switched back to the podcast because thinking too hard at night on a highway was a specific kind of exhausting he recognized and tried to avoid. The auction catalog was on the passenger seat in a manila folder. He had printed it at the FedEx on Maple 3 days earlier, which had cost him $11 that he had noted in the small expense ledger he kept in the glove box. Not because $11 was going to change anything at a Christie's auction on Park Avenue. Because Daniel Reeves had been keeping expense ledgers since he was 26 years old, when his father had died and left him a hardware store in Akron that was $12,000 behind on its lease and 40 years behind on its filing systems. And he had learned that the people who paid attention to $11 were the same people who eventually understood where the larger numbers were going. He had been right about that. He had been right about several things over the past decade, though not always at the right time, and not always in ways that felt like being right at the moment they happened. He stopped for coffee at a rest stop outside of Youngstown. He sat in the parking lot with the engine off for a few minutes. He thought about the letter in his jacket pocket. He thought about the 4 parcels of the Whitmore estate outside Montauk. He thought about his daughter Emma, who was 9 and had her mother's eyes, and his stubborn habit of needing to understand the reason for things before she would agree to them. He had told Emma he was going to New York for a business meeting. She had said, "What kind of business meeting?" He had said, "An important one." She had said, "That's not an answer, Dad." He had said, "An auction." She had said, "What are you buying?" He had thought about that for a second and then said, "I'm not sure yet." Emma had processed this with the seriousness she applied to most things and then said, "Okay, but call me when you get there." He had called her from the rest stop in Youngstown. She had already been asleep. He had listened to her breathing for a moment through the phone and then said goodnight quietly to Mrs. Petrocelli, who had answered, and gotten back on the road. He reached Manhattan at 6 in the morning. He had a reservation at a Hampton Inn on West 35th that cost him $142 for the night, which was the cheapest room he had been able to find within walking distance of Christie's. He showered. He changed into the clothes he had brought in: a canvas duffel bag, pressed khaki trousers, a dark button-down shirt, the canvas work jacket because he didn't own a blazer that fit well and had decided not to perform something he wasn't. He ate a granola bar from the duffel. He put the letter back in his inside jacket pocket, where he had been carrying it for 11 months, and walked the 6 blocks to Christie's on Park Avenue in the April morning, when New York was doing its complicated spring thing, with light coming between the buildings at a low angle that made everything look like the beginning of something. He arrived 40 minutes before the auction started. He was the only person in the room wearing a work jacket with a paint streak on the shoulder. He sat down anyway. Celeste Verano arrived at Christie's the way she arrived at most things. 12 minutes early, completely prepared, and already in a conversation on her phone that she finished before she sat down rather than continuing it through the first portion of the proceedings, which was a professional courtesy that the people who knew her well understood was genuine, and the people who didn't know her assumed was performed. She was 44 years old. She had built Verano Holdings from a 2-person real estate consultancy, operating out of a shared workspace in Brooklyn, into a firm that managed a portfolio of assets valued at north of $2 billion. A number that had started as an aspiration written in a notebook 15 years ago, and had crossed the threshold 3 years earlier in a way that she had marked privately by going home and cooking dinner by herself, and opening a bottle of Barolo she had been keeping since her first significant deal closed. She had grown up in Bensonhurst, the daughter of an electrician and a bookkeeper who had both worked their entire adult lives in the honest arithmetic of other people's accounts, and from whom she had inherited a specific variety of financial pragmatism that had served her better in private equity than an MBA would have. She had the MBA anyway from Columbia because she had understood early that the world would not extend her the same benefit of the doubt that it extended to people who arrived with certain credentials, and she had decided that acquiring those credentials was more efficient than arguing about their relevance. She was not fundamentally a person who wasted time arguing about things she could simply resolve. She had attended the Christie's Fine Art and Estate Collection auction every April for 6 years. She had a specific interest in a category of work that was not fashionable enough to attract the large institutional bidders, but had historical significance that the market consistently underpriced. She had an eye for it. She had a methodology for it. She had, in 6 years, acquired a collection that 3 independent appraisers had told her was worth substantially more than she had paid for any of it. She sat down 2 seats from Daniel Reeves without looking at him, opened her catalog to the tabbed pages, and made 2 small notations in the margin with a fine point Pilot G2 pen that she kept in the exterior pocket of her bag. She had been using the same model pen since graduate school because it was precise and never skipped, and cost $1.49 at any Staples, which was the kind of detail about herself she did not share in interviews. She noticed the man in the work jacket because she noticed everything in a room, and because the paint streak on the shoulder was at odds with everything else about him in a way that was interesting rather than dismissive. She noted it the way she noted any data point that didn't immediately resolve. She set it aside. Then the auction started, and the man in the work jacket bid on the first lot. He bid cleanly. No hesitation, no performance, no theatrical pause before raising the paddle. He bid the way someone bids when they have already decided the number and are executing a decision rather than making one in real time. Celeste looked at him properly for the first time. He lost the first lot to a phone bidder from London. He noted something in the margin of his catalog. He moved on to the second lot with the same composure. Celeste found this interesting in a way that she was not immediately able to categorize, and she was accustomed to being able to categorize things immediately. She looked at him for 1 more second and then looked back at the auction. It was after the third lot, which he also lost, that she turned and said the thing about the Ferrari. She said it without thinking, which was unusual for her and which she would think about later. But she said it because there was something about the way he was sitting, the absolute stillness of it, the focused patience of a man who was not in a hurry despite having traveled all night, that struck her as either completely delusional or entirely deliberate. And she was accustomed to recognizing the difference. She wanted to know which one it was. She found out 32 minutes later in a way she had not anticipated. The letter had been written by a man named Raymond Whitmore. Raymond Whitmore had died 11 months before the Christie's auction, at the age of 79, in a hospital in Southampton, New York, in the early morning hours of a Tuesday in May, with his son Marcus beside him and his daughter Patricia on a plane from London that landed 2 hours after he was gone. which was one of the things she would carry with her for a long time afterward, and which she spoke about only to the people she trusted most. Raymond Whitmore had been, in the formal record, a moderately successful real estate developer from Long Island, who had built a small portfolio of commercial and residential properties in eastern Suffolk County over 4 decades, beginning in the late 1970s, when land in that part of New York was cheap enough that a man with a good eye and a willingness to be patient could acquire meaningful positions without significant capital. He had not been famous. He had not been profiled in the Times or featured in architectural digests or mentioned in the social columns of East Hampton's local papers. He had built things quietly and sold some of them, and held others, and died with an estate that his children understood to be solid without knowing its full dimensions. Raymond Whitmore had also been, in a way that nobody outside a specific circle of people knew, one of the 3 men who had assembled the original land position that became the Montauk Lighthouse Preservation District in 1987, a transaction that had been structured in a way that was brilliant for the 1980s, somewhat problematic by the standards of the 1990s, and entirely invisible to the people who had built their careers on the land that surrounded it. He had known this was true for 30 years. He had written it down in the letter. Daniel had received the letter because Raymond Whitmore had wanted him to receive it, not as a gift, not as an inheritance in any legal sense, but as a deliberate act of passing something along to a person he had watched for 4 years and concluded was the right person to receive it. Raymond and Daniel had met because of a water heater. This required some explanation. Daniel had a second business alongside the hardware store. He had started it 6 years earlier after Emma was born, and his wife Claire had died of a brain aneurysm at 31 years old in the kitchen of their house in Akron on a Saturday morning in September, while Daniel was upstairs putting Emma down for a nap. He had come downstairs to find her on the floor, and the 14 months that followed had been the kind that reconfigured a person at the structural level. And the man who came out the other side of them was not the same man who had gone in, though he retained most of the original's habits and preferences, and his father's hardware store, and the stubborn, quiet persistence that was the primary inheritance of the Reeves family going back 3 generations. The second business was a property preservation and remediation company. Daniel had started it because in the aftermath of Claire's death, he had needed something that was absorbing enough to occupy his mind during the hours Emma was asleep, and because the hardware store gave him both the supplier relationships and the practical knowledge to do it without significant startup capital. He specialized in estates, properties whose owners were elderly or deceased or simply absent for long periods, and the particular category of deferred maintenance that accumulated in such properties over time. Water heaters, roofing, foundation drainage, electrical panels that had been original equipment since the 1970s and were running 4 decades past their intended service life. He was very good at it. He was good at it in the same way his father had been good at the hardware store, which was not a dramatic or obvious kind of good, but the kind that meant people trusted you with their properties and called you back and told other people about you, which in that business was the only marketing that mattered. Raymond Whitmore had called him 4 years before the auction about a water heater in one of his rental properties in Montauk. Daniel had driven out, replaced the heater, noticed 7 other things that needed attention, and written a careful report about all of them with cost estimates that were fair without being inflated, which Raymond had noted because the 2 contractors who had preceded Daniel had written estimates that were politely described as optimistic. He had hired Daniel for the other work. And over 4 years of intermittent contact, work orders, walk-throughs, the occasional coffee at a diner in Montauk when Raymond happened to be in town, something had developed that was not quite friendship in the formal sense, but was the kind of respectful, careful attention that 2 people sometimes extend to each other when they recognize something in common without being able to name it precisely. Raymond Whitmore had recognized in Daniel a person who paid attention to what things were actually worth as distinct from what they were priced at, which was a distinction that Raymond had spent 40 years understanding and that most people he encountered had never fully grasped. He had written the letter 3 months before he died. He had asked Patricia, his daughter, to deliver it to Daniel by hand after the estate was settled, along with a manila envelope containing the documents that would make the letter meaningful rather than merely interesting. Patricia had done this. She had driven to Akron in a rental car on a Thursday in June, sat in the kitchen of Daniel's house on Garfield Avenue, drank a cup of coffee, and handed him the envelope. She had said, "He said you'd know what to do with it." Daniel had read the letter that night after Emma was asleep. He had sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. He had read the documents in the manila envelope with the focused patience of a person who understood that he was holding something that required full attention, and that making any decision before he understood it completely would be a disrespect to the man who had trusted him with it. He had understood it by midnight. He had not slept much. He had spent the following 3 weeks making phone calls to title companies and county clerks' offices, and a property law attorney in Garden City named Howard Finch, who had charged him $370 for 2 hours of his time, and confirmed what Daniel had suspected was true, but had needed a professional to verify. Then he had called Christie's, because the letter told him that the 4 Whitmore estate parcels in Montauk were going to be included in the April estate auction, and that whoever acquired the right to first refusal on those parcels, in combination with the documents Raymond had left in the manila envelope, would be holding something that the market had not yet priced correctly, not by a significant margin. The Christie's estate auction on Park Avenue in April ran 212 lots over approximately 4 hours. Fine art, furniture, jewelry, decorative objects, and at the end, listed almost incidentally at lot 194 through 197, the 4 Whitmore estate parcels in Montauk, Suffolk County, New York. Most of the attendees in the room had come for the first 180 lots. The estate parcels were the kind of item that showed up at the end of an estate auction as an afterthought, a matter of administrative tidiness when real property couldn't be simply divided among heirs, and they had attracted a pre-auction estimate from Christie's appraisers that reflected the parcel values at their surface, which was to say the value of 4 modest undeveloped lots in eastern Suffolk County, without accounting for the specific easement situation that Raymond Whitmore had structured in 1987, and that Daniel now understood in full. Celeste Verano was not there for the parcels. She was not there for lots 194 through 197. She was there for lot 41, a collection of early 20th century architectural drawings with provenance in the old Long Island estate building tradition. Lot 87, a documented Tiffany Studios floor lamp from the Laurelton Hall period, and Lot 112, a series of hand-colored lithographs from an 1889 survey of New York Harbor that she had been tracking for 2 years. She had the paddles ready. She had the numbers in her head. She had never, in 6 years, paid more than 15% over her ceiling on any lot she wanted. She had made the bet with Daniel in the impulsive spirit of someone who was 95% certain. She was about to illustrate the difference between money and serious money to a man from Ohio in a paint-streaked jacket. She had made it without asking what lots he was interested in, which was the single informational gap that would cost her the next 32 minutes. The auction began. Daniel bid on Lot 6, a Federal period mahogany card table with original hardware. He lost it to a dealer on the phone. He noted the final price in the margin of his catalog. He bid on Lot 17, a collection of mid-century American landscape photography that the Christie's notes had listed as attributed to rather than definitively documented, which meant the estimate was conservative because most buyers weighted the attribution uncertainty as a discount. Daniel had done his own research on the photographs and had arrived at a different conclusion about the documentation question than Christie's had. He bid to the number he had written in his catalog before the auction began and stopped there. He lost it by $40 to a woman in the third row. $40. The woman in the third row was startled when the gavel came down, as though she had expected one more counter. Daniel had stopped because $40 over his number was still over his number, and the habit of stopping at the number was what made the number worth having. Celeste had been watching. She noticed the precision of it. She made a small notation in her own catalog margin. Lot 41 came up. Celeste bid on it efficiently and acquired it at $11,000, $200 below her ceiling. She was pleased with this in the measured way she was pleased with things that went as planned. Lot 53 was a collection of surveying instruments from a Long Island County assessor's office, deaccessioned from an estate, with an estimate of $800 to $1,200. It was an odd lot, the kind that appears occasionally in estate auctions when nobody is quite sure what category it belongs to. The Christie's description was 2 sentences. The instruments were in original cases. They dated from the late 1890s. Daniel bid on Lot 53 and won it for $950. Celeste looked at him. He was writing the lot number in his catalog. She looked back at the auction. Lot 87, the Tiffany Studios floor lamp. Celeste acquired it at $34,000, $1,000 over her ceiling, because a phone bidder from Chicago had pushed harder than she anticipated and she had made the decision that the lamp was worth the ceiling breach. She noted this in her ledger as she accepted the paddle confirmation from the assistant. The auction moved through its middle sections, lot after lot. Daniel bid on 7 more items over the following 90 minutes. He won 4 of them. He lost 3. Everything he won was in the category that Celeste was beginning to understand as deliberate. Items with a documentation question that suppressed the estimate. Items that carried quiet historical significance without the kind of provenance that attracted large institutional buyers. Items that were worth more than they appeared to be worth if you had done the specific research that established the gap. He was, she realized, doing exactly what she did. In a completely different market segment at a completely different price point with the same underlying methodology. She sat with that for a moment. Lot 112, the hand-colored harbor lithographs. Celeste bid. A phone bidder from San Francisco came in at the estimate ceiling. Celeste went 3,000 over. The phone bidder went higher. Celeste went higher. The phone bidder came back. Celeste said her final number and stopped. The phone bidder got the lithographs. She had been watching the lot for 2 years. She had missed it by $4,000 to a buyer she couldn't see. She sat with the discipline of not reacting in the way she had trained herself over 15 years, which was to say she made the notation, accepted the outcome, and moved forward. She looked over at Daniel. He had not bid on lot 112. He was reading the notes for lot 113. She said, "You didn't bid on that one." "Not my category," he said. "What's your category?" He looked at her for a moment. "Things worth more than they look." She looked at him steadily. "That's my category too." He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "I've been watching you for about an hour." The auction moved forward. Lot 194. Whitmore Estate Parcel A, a 2.3-acre undeveloped lot in eastern Montauk, Suffolk County, New York. Estimate $14,000 to $18,000 based on comparable undeveloped land in the district. The room had thinned. 40 minutes before closing, most of the buyers who had come for the significant lots had what they came for and were either gone or mentally elsewhere. A real estate developer named Garson from a firm Celeste recognized was sitting 3 rows ahead. A representative of a local preservation land trust was at the back. 2 buyers Daniel didn't recognize were on their phones. Daniel picked up his paddle. Celeste picked up hers. For the first time in the auction, they were bidding against each other directly. Celeste opened at 14,000. Daniel came in at 15. She went to 16. He went to 17. She went to 18, which was the ceiling of the Christie's estimate, which was the point where most buyers who were not specifically prepared would begin to hesitate. Daniel went to 19. She went to 20. He went to 22. She stopped. She looked at him. He had gone 2,000 over the estimate on a parcel that the Christie's description had called suitable for preservation or development, subject to local ordinance. There was nothing in the Christie's description that justified 2,000 over estimate. She had a question she could not answer, and she was not accustomed to having questions she could not answer at a lot she was bidding on. She let Parcel A go. Daniel won it at $22,000. Parcel B came up immediately. Celeste went in fast, establishing momentum, trying to read what Daniel would do. Daniel matched her through the estimate and went over it again, steadily, without drama, to a number that was 20% above what any comparable sale in the district had established as reasonable. She stopped bidding at Parcel B. She was watching him now with the full attention she gave to things she needed to understand. She let Parcel B go. Parcel C, she came in hard, top of estimate immediately, forcing him to respond to her rather than setting pace himself. He responded. She went higher. He went higher. She set a ceiling that was 30% above estimate and held it. He went to 31% above and stopped moving. She thought about going to 32. She thought about the specific fact that she did not know why these parcels were worth this to him, and the people who had beaten her in 30 years of doing this business had almost always been people who knew something she didn't. She stopped bidding at Parcel C. He won Parcel C, Parcel D, the last of the 4. The room was quiet in the specific way of people who have realized something interesting is happening that they don't entirely understand. Celeste looked at Daniel for a moment before the bidding started. He was looking at the podium. His hands were quiet in his lap. He had the stillness she had noticed in the first 5 minutes, and she understood it now as the specific composure of a person who has prepared so completely that there is nothing left to be anxious about because every scenario has already been worked through. She made a decision. She did not bid on Parcel D when the gavel came down and Daniel won Parcel D at 20% above estimate. She turned to him and said, "What do you know that I don't?" He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out an envelope. He said, "His name was Raymond Whitmore. He died 11 months ago. He spent 4 decades building something in Montauk that nobody knew how to read until he wrote it down. He handed her the letter. She read it in the remaining minutes of the auction while the final 3 lots moved through the room around them. When she finished reading, she looked up at him with the expression of someone recalibrating something fundamental. She said, "The easement language in the 1987 district agreement." He said, "Yes." She said, "If this is authenticated, I've had it verified by Howard Finch in Garden City and a title company in Riverhead. It's clean." She sat with that for a moment. Around them, the final gavel of the auction fell and the Christie's room began its end-of-session movement, the quiet mechanical activity of a place returning to neutral after the thing it was built for. "You drove from Ohio for this," she said. "I drove from Ohio for this." She looked at the letter in her hand. "What do you want with first right of refusal on the parcels?" He said, "I want to build something." "What kind of something?" He thought about it. He said, "The kind that's worth more than it looks." Celeste Verano looked at Daniel Reeves for a long moment. She said, "I owe you a Ferrari." He said, "I said I didn't want the Ferrari." "I know what you said." A pause. "I want to hear what you do want." He picked up his catalog. He wrote a number in the margin and slid it across to her. She looked at it. She said, "That's not a lot for what you're holding." "I'm not selling it," he said. "I'm looking for a partner." In the spring of 1987, 3 men had assembled a land position on the eastern edge of Montauk that was, in the raw geography of it, 22 acres of scrub oak and sandy marsh at the point where the Montauk Highway curves north toward the Lighthouse Road. The land had no view of the water. It was not, by the standards of the Hamptons land market, desirable in any of the ways that drove prices in that corridor. It was, by those standards, the kind of land that fell through the gaps of serious attention. The 3 men were Raymond Whitmore, a building contractor from Wainscott named George Capello who died in 1998, and a third man named Arthur Devlin who had moved to Florida in the early 1990s, and whose heirs had sold his position to a conservation land trust in 2004 without understanding what they were selling. What they had assembled in 1987 was not primarily a land position. It was an easement structure. The 3 men had, with the assistance of a Suffolk County land attorney who had since retired, created a framework of cross easements, access rights, and usage covenants that wrapped around the parcels in a configuration that was perfectly legal, fully recorded in the Suffolk County Clerk's office, and almost impossible to understand without reading all 4 instruments together against the map of the district, as it had developed in the decades since. Raymond had understood this structure completely. He had built it deliberately as a long-term position, with the patience of a man who had grown up watching his father hold land in eastern Long Island through cycles that most people called collapses, and that his father called opportunities to wait. The structure did one specific and extraordinary thing. It gave the holder of all 4 parcels, acting together, the right to negotiate directly with the state of New York on any future development or preservation action affecting the Montauk Lighthouse corridor, a corridor that the state had been quietly moving toward a formal preservation designation for the past 6 years, a process that was 6 months from a decision that would require exactly the kind of direct negotiation that Raymond's 1987 easement structure had positioned for. Raymond had known this was coming. He had been watching the state preservation process from his hospital bed in Southampton for the last 2 years of his life, reading the public comment documents and the county board minutes with the focused attention of a man who had been right about a piece of land for 40 years, and was watching the world catch up to him at the end. He had not had the physical resources in his final months to do anything with it himself. His children were not, by nature, the kind of people who would understand what they were holding without being told precisely what it was and exactly what to do with it, which was not a criticism of Marcus and Patricia, simply an accurate reading of who they were and what they were equipped for. He had needed someone who would know what to do. He had known Daniel Reeves for 4 years. He had watched him replace a water heater, fix a drainage problem, write a fair estimate, and turn down a tip that Raymond had offered at the end of a large job because Daniel had said the estimate already included the full value of the work, and he didn't need extra for doing what he said he would do. That last part had settled it for Raymond. He had written the letter. The conversation that turned the bet into a partnership happened over coffee at a small Italian place on 48th Street that Celeste knew because she had eaten there alone on the late evenings of long transaction days for years, and that she liked because it was quiet, and the coffee was reliably good, and nobody there cared who she was. Daniel had left his canvas duffel at the Hampton Inn on West 35th. He sat across from Celeste Verano in his pressed khakis and his work jacket with the paint streak on the shoulder, and he explained the full structure of the easement arrangement in the methodical way he explained most things, from the beginning with the intermediate steps included, because he had found over the years that skipping the intermediate steps was what created the misunderstandings that became expensive. Celeste listened without interrupting. She had a legal pad in front of her. She made notes. She asked 3 questions during the explanation, each of which was precise enough to demonstrate that she had understood everything up to that point and was clarifying the specific things she needed to understand to go further. When he was done, she sat with it for a moment. She said, "How did he find you?" Daniel said, "A water heater." She waited. He said, "I have a property preservation business out of Akron. He had a rental in Montauk. Water heater needed replacing. I came out. He hired me for other work. We had coffee a few times over 4 years. He decided I was the right person to hold this." She said, "Why?" He said, "I turned down a tip." She looked at him. He said, "After a large job, he offered extra." I said no. She said, "That's why he trusted you with 40 years of work." Daniel said, "I think he was watching for a long time and the tip was the last data point." Celeste was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about something. He could see it in the way her pen was still on the legal pad, the specific stillness of someone not writing because the thought wasn't ready to be written yet. She said, "I've been building a position in eastern Suffolk County for 3 years. He said, "I know." She said, "How?" He said, 3 county clerk's office filings, a planning board public comment submission, and a profile in Long Island Business News from 18 months ago that mentioned your firm's interest in the preservation corridor." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You researched me before you came here." He said, "I researched everyone who had active interest in the corridor. You were the most systematic, the most patient." He paused. "You were the one I needed to talk to." She understood something then that she hadn't understood when she turned and made the bet in the Christie's room. He hadn't accepted the bet. He had created the conditions for the conversation he needed to have. She said the Ferrari was never the point. He said, "No," she said, "the first right of refusal demand." He said, "I needed to establish that I had something you wanted. The bet was the fastest way to do that in a room full of noise." He paused. "I'm sorry if it was aggravating." She made a sound that was close to a laugh. It was the kind that surprised her. She looked at the legal pad in front of her. She said, "What are you proposing specifically?" He laid it out. Clean, sequential, each component in its place. The 4 parcels combined into a single negotiating entity under a partnership structure. The state preservation process was running on a timeline that would reach the decision point in approximately 6 months, based on the public record of the county review process. The direct negotiation right that the easement structure created was worth, in the context of that timeline, a number that was substantially larger than the sum of what he had paid for the 4 parcels this morning. But only if it was exercised correctly. Only if the person exercising it understood the state process, had relationships in Albany, and had the capital structure to move at the speed that state transactions required when they arrived. He had the easement structure and the letter. She had Albany and the capital and the relationships. He was proposing a 50-50 partnership in the negotiation entity, with a buyout option that favored neither party and a decision-making structure that required mutual consent for the material steps. She had been in enough partnerships to know that the decision-making structure was where most of them broke. She was listening to his framework with the specific attention she paid to things that seemed too clean, looking for the place where it would start to be complicated. She could not find it. The structure was genuinely clean. She said, "What does your attorney say?" He said, "Howard Finch has drafted a preliminary partnership agreement. I have it on my phone. I can forward it." She said, "Send it to my general counsel's address. He'll review it tonight." She slid a card across the table. He took the card. He looked at it. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket next to where the letter had been. She said, "Why didn't you just call me before the auction? You knew I was the right partner. Why the theater?" He thought about it. He said, "Because if I'd called you, you'd have had your people research me before we met. You'd have looked at a property preservation company in Akron, Ohio, and made a decision before you saw what I was holding." He paused. "I needed you to see what I was doing before you knew who I was." She understood the logic completely. She didn't particularly like it because she generally preferred directness and found misdirection irritating even when it was precise. But she understood it. She said, "Don't do that again." He said, "I won't need to." She said, "No, I mean in general, if we're going to work together, I need direct." He said, "I understand, I'll be direct." Said, "Starting with this, what's Emma's situation while you're in New York?" He was surprised that she knew Emma's name. He didn't hide the surprise entirely. She said, "You mentioned calling your daughter when you left the auction this morning. I was standing close enough to hear. How old is she?" He said, 9. She said, "Who's watching her?" He said, "My neighbor, Mrs. Petrocelli. Emma's good. She knows the routine." A pause. I told her I'd call by 8. Celeste looked at her watch. It was 7:45. She said, call her, I'll get the check. He looked at her. She said, we have more to discuss. You shouldn't miss the call. He nodded. He pulled out his phone and stepped to the corner of the small restaurant. Celeste watched him for a moment. She saw the way he stood differently when the call connected. The specific change in a person's posture when they're talking to their child. The way the professional composure didn't disappear but rearranged itself around something warmer. She thought about Raymond Whitmore, who had watched a man replace a water heater and decline a tip and decided to trust him with 40 years of work. She understood the reasoning better now. She paid the check. He came back to the table. He said, she's good. She ate dinner. She wants to know if I'm bringing her a New York pretzel. Celeste said, there's a Auntie Anne's in Grand Central. It's on your way back to the hotel. He said, I know. She said, of course you do. A pause. Sounds like she runs things. He said, she does largely. A pause. I let her. It's efficient. Celeste looked at him with the expression she gave things that surprised her usefully. I let mine run things too. He said, you have kids. She said, 2, 14 and 11. They're in Brooklyn with their dad tonight. A pause. We divorced 3 years ago. It's functional. We're good at co-parenting because we're both better at logistics than at being married. He said, that's a generous way to describe it. She said, it's an accurate way. I try to be accurate. He said, I've noticed. They sat in the quiet of the 48th Street restaurant for a moment with the comfortable, still slightly tentative quality of two people who have recognized each other as useful and are beginning to determine whether they are also something more than that. The partnership agreement was signed in late May, 6 weeks after the Christie's auction. Howard Finch and Celeste's general counsel, a careful man named Bryce Ockhaffer who had 20 years of experience in private real estate transactions, and who Celeste trusted with everything she didn't want to think about failing, had reviewed the draft, exchanged 2 rounds of revisions, and arrived at a document that both sides were satisfied with in the measured way of lawyers who have found an agreement they cannot improve. The state preservation process reached its decision point in early September, which was 3 weeks ahead of the timeline Daniel had projected, and 2 weeks ahead of the timeline Celeste's Albany contacts had estimated, because the state had accelerated its review in response to a development proposal from a commercial buyer whose interest in the corridor had intensified when word of the Christie's auction outcome had reached certain desks in certain firms. The direct negotiation right activated precisely as Raymond's 1987 easement structure had intended it to. The negotiation took 8 weeks. Celeste led it, with Daniel present at every material meeting, because it was his letter and his parcels and his understanding of Raymond Whitmore's intent that grounded the technical argument when the state's property division raised questions about the easement instruments that required someone who had read Raymond's letter to answer fully. The outcome was a preservation purchase and development rights agreement in which the state of New York acquired 3 of the 4 parcels for inclusion in the Montauk Corridor Preservation District, and the partnership retained the 4th parcel with an agreed access easement structure and a buildable development envelope that had been negotiated from the corridor agreement itself. The total value of the transaction was $4.7 million. Daniel had paid a combined total of $89,000 at the Christie's auction in April. Celeste had contributed the capital, the relationships, and the 8 weeks of negotiation work. They split the outcome 50-50 under the partnership agreement. On the evening after the final closing documents were signed, Daniel was in the kitchen of the house on Garfield Avenue in Akron making Emma's dinner. Pasta with the butter and parmesan she had requested, no sauce, which was her standing order and which Daniel had long since stopped negotiating when his phone rang with Celeste's number. He said, closing went through. She said, wired 30 minutes ago. He said, good. A pause. She said, how are you feeling about it? He said, good. He stirred the pasta. Like something that was supposed to happen happened. She said, Raymond would be pleased. He thought about Raymond sitting in a diner in Montauk, drinking bad coffee and looking out at the parking lot with the unhurried quality of a man who had been waiting for things to arrive for 40 years and had gotten comfortable with the pace of it. He thought about a man writing a letter 3 months before he died, placing 40 years of work in the hands of someone he had assessed through 4 years of water heaters and drainage fixes and 1 declined tip. He said he would have enjoyed the auction. She said he would have enjoyed the Ferrari bet. He smiled. I think that part was mostly you. She said, it was impulsive. I don't usually do impulsive. A pause. You engineered the conditions for it. He said, mildly. She said, I told you direct. He said, I engineered the conditions for it. She made the sound that was close to a laugh, the good kind. He had been learning its register over the 5 months since Christie's and had come to recognize it as the sound she made when something surprised her in a way she found genuinely useful. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at her father on the phone and then at the pasta and then at her father with an expression that was a precise assessment of the phone to pasta priority situation. He said into the phone, "I need to finish dinner." Celeste said, "Tell Emma I found a bakery in Brooklyn that does the same pretzel she liked from Grand Central. I'll bring them when I come to Akron next month," he told Emma. Emma considered this. She said, "Is that the Ferrari lady?" He said, "She's not technically the Ferrari lady. She kept the Ferrari." Emma said, "Tell her thank you for the pretzel advance notice." He relayed this. Celeste said, "She's running things again." He said, "Efficiently." He served the pasta. The buildable development envelope on the fourth parcel, the one the partnership had retained from the state transaction, sat on the northeast corner of the original Whitmore position, adjacent to where the Montauk Highway curves toward the Lighthouse Road. It was not, in the conventional sense of Eastern Long Island real estate, a spectacular piece of land. No water view. No established address prestige. Scrub oak and sandy margin, 11/10 of an acre in a buildable envelope that the State Preservation Corridor Agreement had defined with some precision. It was, however, positioned at exactly the point that the state's own documents described as the primary pedestrian access node for the new Montauk Lighthouse Preservation District. Raymond had known this when he assembled the position in 1987. He had not specifically anticipated the pedestrian access node language, which was 37 years in the future when he was standing in a Suffolk County recorder's office with George Capello and Arthur Devlin completing the easement instruments. But he had understood that the land at the corridor's natural entry point would eventually be worth paying attention to, in the specific way that land at the threshold of something significant is always eventually worth paying attention to. Daniel understood this the same way. He had understood it from the letter. He and Celeste had discussed the fourth parcel through the summer and the fall, in the practical way they discussed most things, directly with the assumptions stated, the disagreements examined, and the conclusions earned rather than asserted. They disagreed about one thing productively. Celeste's initial inclination was to develop the parcel commercially, a visitor services building of some kind, food, retail, interpretive displays for the preservation corridor. A low-density but revenue-generating use that fit the state's corridor framework and was financeable at current rates. She had done the proforma. It worked. It was not spectacular, but it was solid, and it was appropriately proportionate to the land's actual position in the market. Daniel's inclination was different. He had spent the summer thinking about what Raymond had intended. Not what Raymond had written in the letter. The letter was specific about the easement structure and general about the vision. But what a man who had held a piece of land for 40 years and written a letter about it 3 months before he died had actually been trying to build. He thought Raymond had been trying to build something that his children would understand the value of after it was built. Something that would be visible as good work after the fact, the way good work usually was. Something that fit the land rather than filling it. He had proposed this to Celeste in November, sitting in the 48th Street restaurant again, which had become the default location for their significant conversations, because the coffee was still reliably good and neither of them had suggested changing it. She had listened to his reasoning. She had asked questions. She had pushed back on 2 points that she thought were romantic rather than practical. He had acknowledged both points and modified the proposal accordingly. She had looked at the revised framing for a long time. She had said, "A preservation interpretive center with community access programming, nonprofit operating structure, leased to a management organization," he said, "funded by the corridor agreement's community benefit allocation. The state set aside a capital grant for exactly this use. We qualify under the terms we negotiated." She said, "You knew about that grant when we were negotiating." He said, "Yes." She said, "You didn't mention it." He said, "I was waiting to see if the fourth parcel discussion would arrive here on its own." She looked at him. He said, "I didn't want to steer it. I wanted to see if you'd see it the same way." She said, "And if I hadn't," he said, "I'd have made the commercial case. It works. The proforma is solid." A pause. "But I'm glad you got here." She said Raymond would be pleased about the interpretive center. He said, "I think that's what the letter was actually building toward." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I need the state grant application by February 15th. The community benefit allocation closes in March." He said, "I have a draft." Of course he did. The February half-term school break was the first time Emma came to New York. She was 9 years and 4 months old, and she had been to New York once before on a school trip to the Natural History Museum when she was 7, which she described as having been good primarily because of the blue whale model. Daniel drove this time. He drove the Ranger with Emma in the passenger seat because she had claimed it as hers the moment she could reach it, and the speaker on that side only worked when the heat was on, which in February was the whole drive. They listened to a documentary podcast about the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge for 2 hours, at Emma's request, which she followed with the same focused patience she applied to most things that interested her, which were many things, and asked 6 questions that were better than the questions the podcast host asked. They drove to Montauk first, before the city. Daniel had planned it that way. He wanted Emma to see the land before it was anything. They parked on the highway shoulder near the curve and walked the 11/10 of an acre in the February cold with the scrub oak bare and the sandy margin visible and the lighthouse road running north toward the point. Emma walked with her hands in her pockets and her eyes doing the systematic inventory of a person who had grown up watching her father assess properties. She said, "This is the one from the auction." He said, "1 of 4. This is the last one." She said, "What's going to be here?" An interpretive center, a building for the preservation district, community programming. She said, "Like a museum." He said, "Smaller, more like a place where people learn what the place is before they go into it." She looked at the land. She said, "The lighthouse is that way." He pointed. She nodded. She said, "I think it should have a good children's section." He said, "I'll pass that along." She said, "To the Ferrari lady." He said, "To Celeste." Emma looked at him. She had her mother's eyes. She had the particular directness that came with those eyes. She said, "Is she coming to Montauk?" He said, "She's meeting us in the city tonight." Emma processed this. "For dinner?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Is she bringing the pretzels?" He said, "I think those are for Akron." Emma looked back at the land. She said, "Dad." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Raymond sounds like he was good at waiting." Daniel looked at his daughter in the February light, the lighthouse road running north behind her, the scrub oak bare and ordinary and entirely unremarkable unless you had read a letter about it and understood what a man had been waiting for 40 years. He said, "He was one of the best I've ever heard of." She said, "You're like that too." He didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "Mrs. Petrocelli says you're like that. She says you waited a long time to do something bigger." He looked at the land. He thought about Claire, about the kitchen on Garfield Avenue on a September morning when everything reorganized. He thought about the years of expense ledgers and fair estimates and one declined tip and a letter in his jacket pocket for 11 months. He said, "I wasn't waiting. I was just paying attention." Emma considered this distinction with the seriousness it deserved. She said, "I think those might be the same thing." She was probably right. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood for a moment in the February cold, looking at 11/10 of an acre of scrub oak and sandy margin on the northeast corner of a position that a man had assembled in 1987 and waited 40 years to see become what it was going to be. The lighthouse was 2 miles north. You couldn't see it from here, but you could see the road that led to it. And you could see, if you had read the letter and understood the position, exactly why Raymond Whitmore had stood on this corner in 1987 and decided it was worth building something for. Some land tells you what it wants to be if you pay enough attention. Some work outlasts the person who does it. Some things are worth more than they look. They walked back to the Ranger. Emma got in the passenger seat and turned the heat on before Daniel had started the engine. The speaker crackled to life. She said, "Can we do the Brooklyn Bridge podcast again? I have more questions." He said, "We can do the Brooklyn Bridge podcast again." He pulled back onto the highway and drove north toward the Lighthouse Road, and then east toward the city, through the February afternoon, toward the dinner that was waiting, toward the building that would eventually stand on 11/10 of an acre of scrub oak at the edge of something that was taking its time becoming what it was. Emma found the episode. She settled into the passenger seat with the specific comfort of a 9-year-old who is exactly where she expected to be. The heat was on the whole way. Daniel Reeves got home to Akron on a Sunday evening in late March, 4 days after the state grant application for the Montauk Interpretive Center was submitted. He got home before Emma was in bed, which was the benchmark he had held for years as the minimum of what being home meant, and he made it with 40 minutes to spare. He parked in the driveway. He sat in the Ranger for a moment before going in. He had the habit of giving himself a minute between the road and the house, which Emma had once described accurately as Dad doing the decompression thing, and which he had confirmed was accurate and declined to change. He thought about Raymond Whitmore, who had watched a water heater replacement and a fair estimate and a declined tip, and decided to trust a person with 40 years of work. He thought about patience as a form of paying attention, about the difference between waiting for something and watching for it, about how the people who understood value ahead of the market were usually the people who had done the quiet work of looking at things clearly before the noise arrived. He thought about Celeste, who had made a bet impulsively in a Christie's room and had been right about what was worth paying attention to even before she understood what she was paying attention to. He thought about Emma telling him that paying attention and waiting were probably the same thing, which was the kind of observation that landed differently coming from a 9-year-old than it would have coming from anyone else. He thought about the fourth parcel, the scrub oak and sandy margin at the curve of the Lighthouse Road, and the building that was going to stand there eventually with its community programming and its good children's section, and the small acknowledgement in the entrance that the partnership's legal documents would record as Whitmore Reeves, which was a name Raymond would never see but which Daniel intended to earn. He went inside. Emma was at the kitchen table with homework. She looked up. She said, "Did you get the pretzels?" He put the Auntie Anne's bag on the table. She opened it. She looked inside. She looked up at him with the expression she got when something was exactly right. She said, "She got the cinnamon sugar." He said, "She remembered." Emma took a pretzel out of the bag and said with the directness of someone who had been thinking about something and had arrived at a conclusion, "Dad, I like Celeste." He said, "I know you do." She said, "I think you like her too." He sat down at the table. He said, "I think that's probably accurate." Emma ate her pretzel. She said, "Good, Mrs. Petrocelli will be pleased." He said, "Mrs. Petrocelli has opinions about everything." Emma said, "She's usually right, though." He conceded the point. The kitchen was warm. The homework was spread across the table. The Auntie Anne's bag was on the counter. Outside the window on Garfield Avenue, the Akron evening was doing its quiet thing, the street lights coming on, the neighborhood settling into itself for the night. Some things were worth more than they looked. Some work was built to outlast the person who did it. And some evenings were simply exactly what they were: small, unhurried, warm in the specific way of things that have been earned rather than arranged. And it was enough to sit in them without asking for more. Daniel Reeves sat at the kitchen table with his daughter and did not ask for more. It was enough. It was more than enough.